All right, so for the final section of the autonomic nervous system, we're going to talk about the higher command centers for the autonomic nervous system. So first and foremost, we have the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is basically the boss. Okay, hypothalamus is the boss. This is the main integrative center of all autonomic nervous system activity. Okay, so we have hypothalamus is the boss. And the hypothalamus receives subconscious cerebral input from the limbic lobe connections. So we have some emotional input that will influence the hypothalamus, right? So that's why there is an arrow going from the limbic system to the hypothalamus, because the limbic system is going to send some subconscious input to the hypothalamus to influence functions like heart activity, body temperature, blood pressure, balance of water, and also some endocrine activity. And the hypothalamus, in turn, is going to react. It's going to send out information in response to fear and emotional responses, which will influence the way that the autonomic nervous system is going to function and also the behavior, right? So this is kind of where our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system are going to come into play. If you are, for example, running for your life, that would be a fear-induced response. So this emotional emotion that you're feeling is going to send information to the hypothalamus, letting the hypothalamus know that you're in a situation where you're running for your life. And then the hypothalamus is going to take that information from the limbic system and send out information to different target effectors, modify the activities that are going on in the body in order to respond to that stimuli that it just received from the limbic system. Now, we have other controls other than just the hypothalamus, though, that are helping to modulate the activities that are going on in the autonomic nervous system. And those would be things like from the cerebral cortex. This would be a subconscious level control. Also from the reticular formation and also the spinal cord. So let's talk about some of these things. So first and foremost, let's talk a little bit more about our boss here. In terms of controlling the autonomic nervous system, it may have a direct or an indirect response. And this is going to happen through our reticular system. So some of the centers of hypothalamic control would be controlling things like heart activity and blood pressure, body temperature, water balance, and endocrine activity. Because remember, the hypothalamus is this area here. Okay, and so the hypothalamus is very close to the pituitaries, which are also very important for endocrine activity. In addition, the hypothalamus is also going to be important for emotional stages and biological drives like rage, pleasure, hunger, thirst, sex, that kind of thing. And then finally and majorly would be the reactions to fear in the fight or flight system, which I kind of talked about on the last slide already. Okay. So the other controller here of the autonomic nervous system I mentioned before would be the cerebral cortex. And this is actually going to involve the limbic system as well. And so these two areas are constantly exchanging information. And so for this reason, this is kind of why, like, whenever we remember a frightening time, our heart would race, and that would be activating the sympathetic nervous system. Alternatively, if you're remembering the smell of a certain food, we start to salivate, or if you see food on the TV, you might start to salivate. And this would be the parasympathetic nervous system kind of kicking into action, because we have this communication going on between our frontal lobe, our cerebral cortex, our limbic system, and our hypothalamus, all interacting to produce responses. In terms of the brainstem, the reticular formation is going to be the one that exerts the most direct influence over autonomic functions, you know, of course, other than the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the boss, but coming in close second would be our reticular formation. And the example here that I'll give you is that we have certain motor centers that are located in the medulla that regulate our heart rate and our blood vessel diameter. And there's other medullary areas, so other areas in the medulla that help to oversee GI activities or gastrointestinal activities. Most sensory impulses that are involved in any sort of autonomic reflexes reach the brainstem via that vagus nerve, which, if you guys remember, cranial nerve 10. And then in terms of the midbrain centers, so the midbrain of the brainstem is going to control muscle that is concerned with the pupil and the lens. So either dilating or constricting the pupil, and bending or flattening out the lens. So dilating the pupils, we know, would help us to see better. Constricting the pupils happens whenever there's, say it's like a really bright sunny day, the pupils will automatically constrict, which decreases the amount of light that's entering the eye to help protect your eye. And then the lens, remember the lens is what will bend light that's coming into the eye so that you can focus on objects, either far away if it's the sympathetic nervous system that's activated, or close up if it's the parasympathetic nervous system that's activated. And then finally, in terms of the spinal cord down here, the spinal cord is going to control autonomic reflexes for defecation, micturition, which just is the fancy word for peeing, and then also for erection and ejaculation. However, one sort of critical thing here is that these spinal autonomic reflexes can be inhibited. They can be overtaken if we need to. So for example, even if you have to pee, then you can inhibit this if you're not in a position that you're able to perform that particular function. Okay. Excuse me. And then the last slide here is about just some different disorders of the autonomic nervous system. And so the autonomic nervous system is involved in nearly every important process that goes on in the body. So most disorders are going to reflect either exaggerated or deficient controls of smooth muscle activity. And some of the most devastating disorders of the autonomic nervous system are going to be involving blood vessels. So, for example, hypertension is a problem with the autonomic nervous system, because now we have a situation where the vessels are either too constricted, which is going to raise blood pressure, or we're retaining too much fluid, which is going to raise blood pressure. All of these things will have an effect on the blood vessels. Raynaud's disease is a condition where whenever you are cold, say you're like out in the snow, usually what happens is that the blood vessels in your skin are going to constrict and push that blood towards the center of the body to help keep your body warm. But in Raynaud's disease, what happens is that those vessels in your skin, they over-constrict. They get too constricted, or they constrict excessively in response to cold, and this would limit blood supply to that particular area. So the next condition here is autonomic dysreflexia. And autonomic dysreflexia is when you have the sudden onset of excessively high blood pressure. Okay, so it's not just high blood pressure, it's like high blood pressure. And usually this occurs in people that have spinal cord injuries. At usually be either T6 or above. Okay, so if there's a spinal cord injury at T6 or above, and basically how this works is that, say you have a spinal cord injury at, I'm going to say T4, okay? I'm going to draw my little person here. Okay. Looks crazy, but okay. So if you have a spinal cord injury at T4, that means you're going to be paralyzed if it's a severe spinal cord injury, right? And so you might not notice things like when you have a full bladder. And distension of the bladder, sometimes the autonomic nervous system will be confused and it will send a signal up to the brain telling the brain that you need to activate your your autonomic nervous system. And the activation of the autonomic nervous system, specifically, you would be activating your sympathetic nervous system, which would increase heart rate and blood pressure. And all of these things would lead to what's called autonomic dysreflexia. It's just excessively high onset of blood pressure, usually occurs in spinal cord patients or people that have spinal cord injuries at T6 or above. And it will be the sudden onset of really excessively high blood pressure due to things like your clothes being too tight, or a full bladder, and so on and so forth. The next condition here is orthostatic hypotension. And orthostatic hypotension is really interesting because basically what happens here in orthostatic hypotension, and you guys have maybe experienced this before, this is kind of referring to when you stand up too fast and you sort of almost black out for a second, but some people actually do black out and then they pass out. What happens here is that, this is the way that I like to explain it, is if you're sitting in a chair, okay, or if you are laying in bed and then all of a sudden you stand up, So the way that I like to explain this is we have a water bottle. When it's laying on its side like this, the water is pretty well distributed. Sort of the same situation when we're laying in bed, or really even when we're sitting, but we're going to focus here on this laying in bed situation, from laying in bed to standing up. This is when a lot of orthostatic hypotension injuries occur anyway. So think about this water bottle. When it's laying on its side, the water is pretty evenly distributed. And then if all of a sudden you sit it up, where's all the water go? It goes to the bottom, right? Same thing happens in people, except for instead of water, we're talking about blood. So all of the blood pools down to the legs, and for a brief second, our brains don't get enough blood. Okay. This leads to a response by our nervous system saying, contract those muscles, push that blood back up. But for that brief second, the brain doesn't have enough blood. And that leads to what's called orthostatic, which means standing hypotension, drop in blood pressure. So sudden drop in blood pressure when you stand up. Okay. Orthostatic intolerance is just the inability to stand for long periods of time. And this, again, would have a similar sort of situation with the blood situation. You just have to contract your like calf muscles to pump that blood back up to your heart. And some people forget to move their legs when they're standing for long periods of time, and that would lead to orthostatic intolerance. Postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. Sometimes this is also called postural tachycardia syndrome. Sometimes when you stand up or adjust your posture, some people's nervous systems kind of go funky, they go haywire, and then it makes your heart beat really fast. Syncope, so this is okay, I spelled that wrong, I'm sorry. Fainting. Neurogenic bowel, so basically this just occurs whenever you have some sort of like constipation or inability to move things throughout the intestines. And then erectile dysfunction and neurogenic bladder. So neurogenic bladder would be when you can't control your urination. And then erectile dysfunction is also, can tend to be a autonomic disorder. And you're finished with Human A&P 1. So that concludes my lecture for today and my lecture for this semester. So I will talk with you guys next week on our Zoom meeting. I'll send out some more details about that this weekend. But for now, just study this stuff, and I will see you guys soon.